Well, the idea that diet might have something to do with the risk of women developing breast cancer goes back a long time. This is a slide published, data published 50 years ago in The Lancet. And this was drawing attention to the fact that if you just looked at different countries around the world, data here for 23 countries, the countries with apparently high fat intakes, like the UK here and other places in Northern Europe, they have about 5 times the fat intake of somewhere like Japan when the data were collected. And you can see it also that if you looked at breast cancer mortality then, there was about a 5-fold difference. So the UK had 5 times the fat intake, 5 times the breast cancer compared to Japan. A very sort of suggestive graph, and that sparked a huge amount of research on diet and breast cancer. Initially, at least, mostly focused on fat, and the bulk of we have more data on fat and breast cancer than on any other aspect of diet and breast cancer. But yeah, so that was 50 years ago, and we've learnt, well, a lot since then, but in relation to this, we've learnt 2 very important things. The first one is that most of this variation between the countries is not due to differences in diet. A lot of work, some done in our unit, but also in many other places, has shown that much of that difference between the countries is due to factors such as reproductive factors, the number of children women have, the ages they have them, the amount of breastfeeding. So we know a lot of that is not diet. The other thing that really has become clear, because there's been so much focus and so much research on dietary fat, is that fat does not explain this, and that the consumption of fat, at least in middle-aged women, as observed in most Western countries, is not related to their risk of getting breast cancer. That's been shown in a lot of observational studies. The good observational studies have all shown no association of fat. The question was thought to be so important that 2 large randomized trials were set up where women were asked to change what they ate and followed up in the bigger trial for 8 years on average. So absolutely enormous undertaking, a huge amount of work for the scientists and the women doing it. The results were very disappointing. There was no effect of fat. So these are the results. The Women's Health Initiative is the bigger one, more famous, published 10 years ago now. No significant effect of fat. A smaller Canadian trial also produced null results. If you put them together, the risk is very close to 1, showing that in the women who reduced their fat intake, the risk of breast cancer was the same over about 8 years follow-up as in the women who didn't reduce their fat intake. So, huge amount of effort, huge amount of research. Most people would agree now that that's the end of the story for fat. So, what are we doing? Why are we still looking at diet and breast cancer? Do we think there's still things that might be found? Well, 2 of the things that we know very clearly about breast cancer are diet or diet-related. And Jill's just shown some data on this. So we know that obesity strongly predicts risk in postmenopausal women. And we also know, as we've just seen, that alcohol affects breast cancer risk. So I think alcohol is diet, obesity is closely related to diet. So in broad terms, some aspects of diet definitely do affect breast cancer risk. For fat, we've got loads of data, little or no association. But there are lots of other factors still under investigation. I mean, the beauty of diet for people who work on it is you can go on forever because there are so many foods, so many nutrients, you can always come up with a new idea. So, there's a huge amount of research going on. It can be quite confusing, but major factors that are still under investigation are whether big food groups like meat or dairy products or fruit or fibre may affect risk. And the work that's been done so far for all these things really rules out large effects. But that doesn't mean that we should give up and then they're not important, because if there was a small effect on a population level, that would be important because it could affect many thousands of breast cancers. So it's important to use very large studies like the Million Women study to be able to get reliable, precise estimates of the associations, and even if they're small, they might be important, if they're real. And the other thing that's been happening, which again sort of follows on from the previous talk, is that if you look at the literature on diet and breast cancer, until the last few years, almost all of it was based on total number of breast cancers without splitting them up by estrogen receptor status. And about 3 quite high-profile provocative papers have been published recently suggesting that diet might be important, and it might be because it affects estrogen receptor negative breast cancer, and that previous work might have missed that because it's just diluted out by a null association in all the estrogen receptor positive breast cancer. So that seems an important idea that does need further research. So what I'm going to show you now is based on the measurements made at the third survey, the 3-year resurvey in the Million Women study, and we have data in the analysis for 700,000 women, and this was a relatively short dietary questionnaire asking about usual intake of a number of foods. And the details of that have been published 11 years ago. As well as using that, which is the basic method of categorizing women according to their diet, we can get further information from a remeasurement that was done. And this was done about 10 years after the first questionnaire using an internet-based 24-hour recall that was developed in our unit. And in that, women are asked what they ate yesterday and asked to tick off a number of foods. And we have data in the analysis I'll show you for 22,000 women. So it's a remeasure in a subsample which tells you about long-term diet, because obviously if you ask diet once, it may change in the subsequent years. And the data I'll show is based on 29,000 incident cases. Well, as I mentioned, there are many things you could look at. So we discussed this very carefully and decided that we'd look at this relatively short list of major foods and nutrients. So there are 8 foods or food groups, 8 nutrients, usually called macronutrients because they're nutrients that you eat in enough quantity that they provide a lot of energy. So we looked at animal foods, meat, fish, milk, cheese, yogurt, eggs, and also fruits and vegetables. And for nutrients, we looked at total energy intake, but then protein, fat, carbohydrate, sugars, and fibre. Looking at a lot of things generates a lot of results, a lot of statistical significance tests. The way we've approached this is to do a fairly strict assessment of statistical significance. So things that are weak or borderline, we're not going to report as findings. And using this strict criteria, the only things on this list that come through as highly significantly related to the risk of breast cancer are intake of fruit and intake of dietary fibre. So I'm going to show you the results for those. For the other things on the list, we've done the analyses, and none of them show clear evidence of an association with breast cancer risk. So starting with fruit, I'll just explain what's shown in the columns. So over here on the left, this is what women reported on that 3-year survey in terms of their usual intake of fruit. I don't have the total number of women. You've got the numbers of cases here. And that gives you an indication that the most popular category that women chose was this one, so that they ate some fruit, but not as much as 1 fruit every day. So that was the most popular option. And then we've split them up into other categories, with the highest intake category being here, women who said they ate at least 4 portions of fruit on average each day. What's shown in this column is what women in those same categories said when they filled in the internet-based questionnaire on average 10 years later. So if we go to the top actually here, the women who said they ate at least 4 fruits a day, when we resurveyed them 10 years later, on average they reported 454 grams of fruit a day, which is roughly, a portion of fruit is very roughly about 100 grams. So they were reporting about at least 4 portions a day 10 years later. So that suggests that group of women, their diet has been fairly stable, and what they said at the beginning was a reasonably reliable estimate of their intake. If you look up this column, you can see, as expected, the intakes go down. So there is a big range of fruit intake. It's about 60% higher here than in the lowest group. And it's, getting on for 200 grams a day of fruit different. You might also note that this group here, who said they didn't eat that much fruit, when they were remeasured, they're actually reporting quite a lot of fruit. So it may be that the initial questionnaire underestimated what they were eating. It may be partly that there's been some sort of increase in fruit intake on average in the whole cohort of women. But in terms of looking at fruit and risk, these are the numbers to focus on, showing that we've got a difference in fruit intake from 280 grams to 454 grams. These are the numbers of cases in each category, and here we've got the hazard ratio. So you can see these are going down, and there, the women with the highest fruit intake have a hazard ratio of 0.91, which means their risk of breast cancer was 9% lower than that of the women who ate the least fruit. It's not a large difference, but it's on these huge numbers of cases, it's highly statistically significant. So that's fruit. For fibre, shown in much the same format, here they were split into equal groups from the bottom 20% to the top 20%, and this is the remeasured fibre intake. So you can see, as you'd expect, a nice linear gradation of fibre intake, going up by about 40% from the lowest to the highest, and the women in the highest group are eating about 5.4 grams more of fibre per day. So we've got a reasonable range and exposure of fibre intake. What you might also note is that 18 grams is not that much. The recommended intake in the UK has just gone up a few months ago, but over the time of the study, it was 18 grams a day. So you can see that only the women in the top group were meeting the government recommendation for fibre intake, and these people were much lower. Going across to the hazard ratio, you can see the results are rather similar to fruit, actually. So the women in the highest category of fibre intake have an 8% lower risk of breast cancer. We looked at the types of fibre, whether it was coming from fruit or vegetables or cereals, and it seemed that the fibre from fruit was the most associated with risk, which is consistent with what you saw for fruit itself. So the other analyses we've done are for all the food groups and nutrients. We've done sub-analyses splitting the breast cancers according to whether they're estrogen receptor positive or estrogen receptor negative. And in no case, for all those analyses, do we find statistical evidence for a difference according to receptor status. So overall, a null result for this analysis by receptor status. This is just for an example showing you the results for fibre. I showed you the overall result was 0.92. In estrogen receptor positives, it's about the same, 0.91 there, based on over 10,000 cases. For estrogen receptor negatives, much smaller numbers, about 1,600 cases overall. The risk is the decrease in risk appears to be a bit larger. So it's over a 20% reduction in risk for those in the highest fibre intake for ER negative. But the statistical test as to whether this is different from this shows that it's not significantly different. So the conclusions so far are here. First of all, for the 8 major foods, 8 nutrients we've looked at, we don't see any large associations. We don't see any moderate size associations. So we're down to looking at small associations. We looked at estrogen receptor status and we found no significant heterogeneity. The 2 things I've shown you, small inverse associations of risk with consumption of fruit and consumption of fibre, are potentially important because if a 10% reduction, as I showed you for fibre, on average, the women are all eating less than what the government recommends we should be eating. And since we did that, the government has upped the recommendation from 18 grams to about 24 grams, in which case probably almost nobody in the population would be meeting that. So if if the results for fibre are right, then increasing fibre consumption in the whole country would have a very important effect on breast cancer risk. But at the moment, we're sort of not sure, and so the final phrase is saying residual confounding cannot be excluded. It's possible that this is due to associations of fibre with other types of food, other aspects of lifestyle, hormones, etc. So that's what we're worrying about at the moment. Thank you.